Hello, everybody. A couple of days ago, we did a show with Valerie Durham, the CEO and president of Freedom Fest. It's an event, the largest, I think, libertarian conference in America that is gathering this week in Palm Springs. And Valerie was a very interesting, colorful conversation. She gave me her libertarian vision of freedom in America. Of course, she's not the official spokesman for the Libertarian Party. One man who was that spokesman is Spike Cohen. He was the Libertarian Party's nominee for vice president of the United States in 2020. Joe Jorgensen's running mate. He's speaking, Spike. I was going to say Spike Lee, of course. Spike Cohen. A different kind of Spike.
Completely different Spike, yes.
Very different Spike at Freedom Fest this year. As it happens, one of the conversations Spike Cohen is engaged with in Freedom Fest is with Daryl Davis, a civil rights activist who was on the show a few months ago. And I'm thrilled that Spike is joining us from Palm Springs. So, Spike, you're not Spike Lee, are you?
No, I am decidedly not Spike Lee in just about every conceivable way, yes.
And don't take this personally. You're probably the second most famous Spike in America, which isn't bad after somebody like Spike Lee. So I know you're not so much involved in the Libertarian Party anymore, but you did run in 2020 as the vice president. Tell me the story of that. How did you get on the ticket?
That's a story in and of itself. Going back just a couple of years, when I had decided to retire from the work that I was doing before, which was web design and consultation and things like that, I decided that I was going to kind of just pursue things that I had been thinking about a long time, which was politics for the most part. And so I started a podcast in 2018. And it ended up being a co-host on another podcast as well with a company called Muddy Waters Media. And originally it was just me kind of having my friends on to talk about things. And it kind of grew in popularity and reached a point where I was having actual guests on who were people I hadn't previously known. And within a couple of years' time, it had grown to a point where I had been talking with more and more people who were in the Libertarian Party. I had people ask me to run for the vice presidential nomination, which is different. We do it the old school way. Republicans and Democrats now have it where you pick their, through the primaries, you pick their presidential candidate, and then that candidate picks their running mate. We do it the way it used to be, where our delegates in the Libertarian Party pick the presidential candidate, and then right after that, they pick the vice presidential candidate. So I actually ran for my nomination, and I thought I didn't think I'd actually get it. I thought it would be a useful way for me to talk about how we could spread libertarian ideas in a more effective way. And apparently I sold it well because they picked me as the nominee, and the rest has been history.
The rest is indeed history. As I said, you were the 2020 vice presidential nominee, running with a woman called Jo Jorgensen. Maybe we'll come on to that later. What for you, Spike, is libertarianism? What does it mean? You clearly embrace the term. You ran in the party in the 2020 election. What is this term? It's a term that's often thrown around, and half the time, I think, or more than half the time, people don't really quite understand or even think about what they mean by the word.
That's actually true for most people. They'll say that there are a lot of things and not really think about what it means. To me, I boil down libertarianism to what I call the principle of human respect. That is respecting each person as an individual human being. And by doing so, relating that to government, we want a government that doesn't treat us as tax cattle. It doesn't treat us as a political opportunity or a funding mechanism. It treats us as what we are, individual human beings. And I believe that we should allow people to be free to make choices for themselves. Obviously, we cannot allow people to violate the lives, rights, or property of anyone else, because if we do that, to whatever extent we're violating someone else's lives, rights, or property, that means that we're not allowing them to live their lives as they wish. And so that's what libertarianism boils down to. In practical matters, I would like our country to be run under, and I know this sounds crazy, under its actual founding charter, which is the Constitution. And I think that any extra constitutional or unconstitutional governance which has creeped in and grown over time should be completely stripped away and brought back to what we actually were, what was intended, which was a government, that a federal government that had a very small number of limited duties. The rest was left to the states, and more importantly to the people. And for the most part, the government stayed out of our lives.
One of the other speakers, I think he's a perennial speaker at Freedom Fest, is Steve Forbes, the so-called capitalist's capitalist. I think he's a personal friend of Mark Scuson, who is the founder of Freedom Fest. He was on the show also, writing about Benjamin Franklin. He's also an ancestor of Franklin, or Franklin is an ancestor of Scuson. The way you put it, Spike, you don't really sound that different from classic Republicans like Steve Forbes, who essentially want government out of people's lives. I'm not sure on Mark Scouson's political history. I'm not sure if he's still a Republican, but certainly this small government approach, this idea that the founders were intent on creating freedom in America and that they wanted to limit the government as much as they could, seems to me to be a fairly traditional Republican idea.
It's a traditional, well, in I guess in the post 20th, from the 20th century on, that has been a standard Republican talking point. Yeah, maybe even into the late 1800s, that's been a standard Republican talking point. Notice I said talking point. There's been one Republican president, one president during that time who hasn't grown government at all, and that was Calvin Coolidge. Every other president and every other Congress under both Republicans and Democrats have grown the size of government. They have grown the amount of money that they take from the American people. They have grown the national debt. They have grown not just the size of government in terms of its cost or the number of people that work for it, but also its footprint, not just here, but around the world. Its scope of how involved it is in your life. In more recent years, it's gotten more involved in actually watching every single thing that it is you do, so that we more and more resemble something like out of 1984 or A Brave New World. So it might be a great Republican talking point, but when, for example, the current president, who is a Republican and who is kind of the standard bearer for the Republican Party, has grown the government more than any other president before him and has run up more debt than any other president before him, it's kind of hard for them to say that that's truly an idea of theirs. It's definitely a talking point. I just like to see them actually do it when they get elected.
Somebody we had on the show a few years ago was Amity Shlaes, who's the biographer of Calvin Coolidge and a big fan of Coolidge, a classic small government Republican, I guess, in an old-fashioned sense. If Coolidge was still around and was in the Republican Party, would that make you a Republican? I mean, some people would argue that it's all very well remembering Coolidge, nostalgia for Coolidge, but the America of Calvin Coolidge in the early 20s was an entirely different country. It was an agricultural, primarily still in some ways an agricultural country where most people lived in the countryside rather than the town. So comparing it to today is absurd.
Well, comparing America to the America of 100 years ago to the America today is certainly not the case. But that, I don't think that the fact that we have more industry or the fact that we've grown technologically as every other country has means that you should have any less right to the money that you earn. I don't think that it means that you should have any more obligation to have your children and grandchildren have to pay off debts that were made in their name before they were ever even born. You want to talk about taxation without representation. If you're being taxed with interest on debts that were written up before you were ever even born, that's certainly without representation. And of course, we ourselves are having to pay off those debts that were made before we were born. I don't think that a progress in technology or in industry or in anything else means that we as Americans should, for example, should not have as much privacy as we've had in the past, that we shouldn't be able to communicate with each other without fear of the government spying on every single thing we say or write or do electronically. I don't equate that. I mean, yes, things have changed and there are things that will change with that, but I don't think that means that we have less right to the product of our labor or or our privacy, or to not have debts run up in our name.
One of the things I've never quite understood about libertarianism is where it stops and anarchism begins. In my conversation with Valerie Durham a couple of days ago, one of the more animated parts of it was about whether or not all roads should be privatized. And if you choose to drive on a road, you should have to pay a toll. I don't think it's particularly practical, and I'm not entirely convinced by her argument. Would you agree with her that roads, perhaps even electricity and most traditional public utilities should be privatized, and we should, if we want to use them, we should simply pay for them?
I think we should ask the people of Flint what they thought about public utilities and a lot of other people that are forced to pay very high rates, and are then subjected to substandard conditions. And the best they can do is vote for someone else and hope that they change it. In fact, I actually know a lady named Portia Shepherd who's fighting the water board in her part of Alabama, and is being challenged on every front, even though she was duly elected to serve in that capacity, because she's actually saying, "Hey, our rates are too high, and we're not providing good service here." So I think the argument that it is public or that it's run by the government makes it somehow better than one that has a profit motive built in, which means that if they're not serving their consumer, they could actually lose the consumer, which is not the case in so-called public utilities, government-run utilities. I think you could actually make an argument that, and I would make the argument, that when you know that you can lose your customer and not just subject them to your monopoly, then inherently you actually have to provide better services. When it comes specifically to roads, I believe personally that if we were to end taxpayer funding of roads, all of those major corporations that rely on us to be able to get to them and everyone, and them to get to us to provide things to us, would probably step up to provide those services. And because they'd be paying out of their own pockets, they'd be doing so in the most efficient way possible, which means that we would actually see development in that technology that would actually make roads better. You'll notice that the more government involvement there is in things, the more it resembles the same thing that it did 50 years ago. Whereas in things like telecom, which was largely privatized, and the monopolies broken up 50 years ago, we've seen exponential development in those things, and a reduction in the cost relative to the amount of value we get for it. I want to go back to what you asked about anarchism. So libertarianism, there are a bunch of different types of libertarians, and I would largely group them into one of two groups. There's many more, and there's some overlap, but I'm trying to keep this general. You've got the minarchists, who believe that the government that there should be a government, it should be minimal, and it should only, basically what I said, it should exist as a coercive force only to protect lives, rights, and property. And then you have what I'm not sure it's proper to call them anarchists, but we'll call them anarchists for the sake of this, who don't believe that there should be any government. They believe that the idea of you shouldn't hurt people, you shouldn't take from them, you shouldn't order them around, and you shouldn't make people do things against their will. We don't have a carve out just for the government. That should apply to all human beings, including ones who call themselves the government. The reason I increasingly don't call that anarchism is because true anarchism isn't just the elimination of government hierarchy. They actually usually want to eliminate all hierarchy, including in some cases the nuclear family and many other institutions that are voluntary hierarchies that we actually like, that many of us, most of us actually agree with. So I increasingly don't consider myself an anarchist, maybe an anarcho-capitalist or a voluntarist or something like that. But again, I think it's also often when we get into these more esoteric discussions about different brands of libertarianism, while the government is running up trillions of dollars in new debt every year, imposing trillions, tens of trillions of dollars in new taxes every year, and getting more and more involved in literally every single aspect of our lives, creating databases that are keeping track of our every single keystroke and finger press on our phone and every word we've uttered. And soon enough, I would imagine every thought that we have, if we allow it to continue. I think that we have bigger fish to fry. But I would say in general that having a government have a monopoly of something is not in any way inherently better than allowing there to be competing providers who know that they'll lose you as a customer if they don't provide the service you want.
Freedom Fest is going on right now. As I said, it brings together many freedom activists, shall we say, people who think of themselves perhaps as libertarians on the left and the right. What's the word on the floor Spike. You're there. You're in Palm Springs. Doge has been very much in the news, and of course, the Musk split, the feud now with Trump.
Yeah.
What's the feeling on the floor, do you think, about the current administration and indeed guys like Musk and his initiative to cut government through the Doge, the Doge scheme?
Yeah, so I would say there's probably I would say near unanimity among the kind of people that would come to Freedom Fest, which is basically the world's largest annual gathering of freedom lovers, and we'll broadly include libertarians, small government constitutionalists, small government conservatives, things like that. People that love freedom, that see freedom as one of their highest values in terms of what they want to see out of government. I would say there's probably near unanimity about the aims that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy had with Doge, when it was to cut government spending and find inefficiencies in government and all of that. Where I think there's some disagreement is among those who recognize that Donald Trump has completely sold out Doge and everyone who voted for him specifically because of Doge and the promise of a reduced and less intrusive and less costly and less debtful indebted government. And those who still aren't threading that needle and realizing that that Donald Trump has betrayed their vote. If only we had a previous term where that we could compare it to, where Donald Trump had promised to eliminate the national debt, and instead, inside of one term, ran up more debt, almost as much debt as the previous record holder, Barack Obama, took 2 terms to run up. If only we had seen his response to a national crisis, like, for example, hypothetically, a virus, and whether he would allow individuals to make their own healthy choices and just provide them with the information as best as they could, or whether he would empower someone like, again, hypothetically, an Anthony Fauci to guide the states into 50-state lockdowns and many other very harmful measures, which caused catastrophic damage to the lives and livelihoods of basically almost every single American. If we had that to compare it to, a first term to compare it to, maybe we wouldn't be as surprised to see what we have now. But I guess we'll just never know what he would have done in a first term.
All right. So you're, of course, Spike, being satirical here, aren't you?
I've been accused of being sarcastic and facetious at times, yeah.
So you're saying that people should have learned from the first Trump term that he's anything but a libertarian?
I said that I'm saying that I ran for office and traveled to as many of the 50 states as I could to warn them precisely of this, yes.
Some people might come back at you and say, well, RFK, who spoke at Freedom Fest, I think, last year, and is very much, or has historically been involved with the Libertarian Party, often described himself as a libertarian. He's running a large government department, and he is indeed focusing on the very things that you were critical of in the first Trump administration. There's no Anthony Fauci around now. Do you trust RFK Jr. to bring some libertarian principles, at least to healthcare in America?
RFK Jr. started calling himself a libertarian right around the time that he started flirting with the idea of getting our nomination. Prior to that, he had called for people who were climate skeptics to be punished in some way by the government. He had called for in 2020, he actually called for lockdowns to be extended, not just because of the virus, because of COVID, but also because it was, in his estimation, good for the environment that we all just stay home and not live our lives. So I'm not sure I would consider Bobby Kennedy in any real way to be a libertarian in any philosophical sense. He is a member of the party. That means he's a lifetime member of the party. That means that someone else paid $1,500 for him to become a lifetime member right before he decided he wanted to run for the nomination, and then kind of backtracked and ended up dropping out and endorsing Trump. I will say this. I believe that Bobby Kennedy sincerely believes that there are some major problems with our food supply and with big pharma. And I wish him well in any reforms he can make. The problem is, I don't think he's come full circle in understanding why those things exist. When you create the kind of massive regulatory agencies that we have, the USDA, the FDA, and so forth, when those things happen, what happens is the largest providers in those sectors that are being regulated end up capturing those regulatory agencies, initially just to survive the regulations that are coming down, but then eventually they realize that they can create regulatory schemes and barriers to entry that destroy their smaller competition, which they themselves can either afford to pay to comply with, or just not do at all and ignore, and the agencies they've captured cover it up, and ignore it, or if it reaches the point where they've done something that's so terrible that it can't be ignored or covered up anymore, they just create a trust fund that the taxpayers have to pay for, and they indemnify the companies and give them immunity against any kind of protection or against any kind of lawsuits or any kind of accountability for what they've done. And so once I hope that RFK realizes that it is precisely those agencies and the massive amounts of regulatory control they have that have led to the regulatory capture, that have created the big ag and the big pharma, and for that matter, big oil and the military and industrial complex and big everything else, and to work to fight the root cause of it, which is the overregulation that exists in the first place.
You talked earlier about what some people see as surveillance capitalism. You claim the government's watching everything we do through new digital forms. One of the speakers at this year, very controversial fellow, at this year's Freedom Fest is Ross Ulbricht, who describes himself as a champion of digital freedom. He ran a network on the dark web that called Silk Road that resulted in him being put in prison. Then he was pardoned. What's your take on digital freedom? Is Ulbricht for you a model of digital libertarianism? Should we all embrace initiatives like Silk Road, where we can essentially do anything we want?
Well, let's talk about Ross Ulbricht for a minute. Ross Ulbricht created a website, Silk Road, that allowed people to do commerce anonymously. It allowed them to use Bitcoin, which was not worth anywhere near what it is now, but to use Bitcoin to purchase services. They did have rules against certain things. So, for example, they didn't allow anything that exploited children. They didn't allow weapons. He's actually a pacifist. Not all libertarians are pacifists, but he is one, so he didn't allow weapons. And that was pretty much what they did. And so there wasn't going to be violence on there. There wasn't going to be things that were exploitative or anything like that. And other than that, there were many things that were sold on there. Just like there are every single day many things that are sold on Facebook and on X and on YouTube, and many of those things are legal, and some of those things probably aren't legal. And so he provided this platform, which we believe should have been covered under Section 230, where he wouldn't be made liable for things that others are publishing on his platform. Instead, the government arrested him. They seized what is now billions, or I believe tens of billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin from him. They slandered him to the press. They said that he had hired hitmen. There was zero evidence of that, and it actually wasn't even allowed in court. The judge, if you actually go to freeross.org, you can hear all the details of just how terrible his trial was. Basically, they punished him for not taking a plea deal, and they sentenced him to double life in prison plus 40 years, I believe was the sentence, essentially for making a website where other people did illegal things on it. Now, whatever you think about whether or not that should be allowed or what Ross did was good or not, he spent 14 years in prison. And when Silk Road was resurrected by other people, they received much smaller jail sentences that were nowhere near 14 years, much less, double life or life or anything like that. So one of the things that I will always be grateful to President Trump for, he came to our convention last year and he promised that if he was elected, he would free Ross Ulbricht. And within a day or so of him being inaugurated, he did exactly that. I am grateful to him for that. I believe Ross Ulbricht should be free, and I look forward to finally meeting him in person here at Freedom Fest.
Spike, you talk about Section 230. You noted earlier that the government is watching us all the time, that we are living increasingly in a digital panopticon. I assume you're a fan of activists against this government intrusion. But what about the big tech companies? You're in favor of Section 230, but that enables the Facebooks, not just the Silk Roads, but the Facebooks and the Googles of the world to successfully develop their, what some people see as a digital, a form of digital surveillance, of digital capitalism. Are you as fearful of Google or Facebook knowing everything that we're doing as you are of the government? Is there any difference?
There's certainly a difference. One is accountable both to those who would consume its products and ultimately to government if it were to break the law, whereas government has demonstrated itself to be above its own laws, or at least to treat itself above its own laws, even though by edict it's not supposed to be, by law it's not supposed to be, and it's not accountable to us in any real way. We have to pay it, or it will take everything from us. So just for that reason, I'm not as concerned as I am about government, but I certainly am concerned. And I think that that's why I support there being many more alternatives to Facebook and X and YouTube and Google and so forth that allow there to be a much more broad marketplace. But see, there again, the answer isn't restriction. It's just the opposite. The answer is completely opening up the field so that there can be as many competitors as possible and as many different competing models as possible.
But that's apple pie, Spike. No one would argue against that.
Good. But that's what I'm trying to say. So yes, I absolutely believe that it is a concerning thing, and that is why I am a big fan of.
Coming back to your libertarian arguments, perhaps when it comes to Section 230, that
right.
That this is a good thing. At the moment, a lot of people argue that it actually empowers big companies like Google and Facebook not to be accountable for better or worse for what they publish. So in some ways, sometimes, would you acknowledge that the government can, or government regulation at least, can do good, can promote freedom, can fight against what some people think of as surveillance capitalism?
Yeah, so let's talk about Section 230 real quick. So first of all, Section 230 essentially says that platforms, websites, are not legally responsible for something that is published on the platform by someone else. That is the bulk of Section 230. And so I don't believe there's anything about that it protects the spying against Americans or anything like that. I will say this. I think that the problem with having government regulated, it truly becomes a fox in the henhouse situation. We see this over and over again. My organization, You Are the Power, we are fighting against a situation in which, and this is a completely different thing, but it relates back to this.
And we will come to You Are the Power, because I know this is what you're most involved with at the moment. Go on.
No, and I appreciate that, but it relates to this. So we have discovered that nationwide, in far too many cases that can be counted, innocent parents are having their chronically ill children taken from them. They are being wrongfully accused of abuse despite existing medical evidence and sometimes even existing diagnoses that these children's fractures and bruises are being caused by connective tissue disorders and chronic health conditions and genetic conditions and complications from birth. And the reason that they're doing this, I'm trying to distill this as quickly as possible. Essentially, the reason they're doing this is because their state has quotas for the number of people that they have to accuse. And the reason that they're doing that is because the federal government pays them every time they accuse someone of abuse. And the reason they're doing that is because government was given a charter to protect children against abuse. Now, no one watching this says, well, I think that people should be able to abuse their children. No one says that, right? No one thinks that that's okay. And yet what has happened? Government creeping in has led to a situation in which a perverse funding mechanism has been put in place in which innocent children are being taken from innocent parents. Those parents are sometimes put in prison wrongfully, and their children are taken from them forever because they need to fund their bottom line. And so you need to understand why I am so skeptical of government getting involved in things that are legitimate concerns that need to be dealt with. I look at a situation in which the same government that was literally telling and pressuring big tech companies to censor correct opinions during the pandemic, that we would put them in charge of having even more say over what big tech or any tech can say or do on their social media. We've seen what they've done with what power they have. It was to control people and to not allow dissenting opinions. This and on both left and right. Anytime someone says something that is outside of the Overton window, here comes the government to send a bunch of angry emails and even to drag the owners of these platforms up into Congress and to blame them for the fact that those things are being said or done, when sometimes in some cases it turns out what was being said or done was actually true. But regardless, you had the government was using it to control social media. So I think the answer is the opposite. I think if you have the government less involved in the internet and social media, you're not going to have these massive monopolies that are growing. You'd have the opposite. They wouldn't be able to control and have this monopolistic control, and you'd have more alternatives to it so that they'd actually have to be accountable to the people consuming their product, and they'd be less spying on us.
I wonder if
And
there
I
are,
want to say, and I will also say, it's never going to be perfect. And I think anyone that proposes a utopia is lying to you, themselves, or both. But I think will have, on the balance, less of the things we don't want to see, like over surveillance, like spying, like monetization of our data, and so forth. If we have more alternatives, including ones whose business model doesn't include those things.
I wonder if there are two Spike Cohen's talking here. Earlier in the conversation, Spike, you noted the threat of big pharma. We talked about big tech.
Mhm.
I assume you think of big oil and big other industrial conglomerates in the same context. And yet you're also strongly against, it seems at least implicitly, any kind of antitrust initiative. So how is big tech or big pharma, how are they ever going to get split up?
So this is exactly, and I think this is where the misunderstanding may be. I recognize that these things exist precisely because of the regulatory environment that exists. It is nearly impossible for a small oil or a small ag or a small pharma or a small anything else to exist in the regulatory environment that the lobbyists for the big companies have had the regulatory agencies create for them and everyone else. They have the endless mountain of attorneys to make sure that they're complying, or the lobbyists to make sure that the politicians and regulators look the other way when they violate the rules. The smaller companies don't have that. It is precisely the regulatory capture that comes. All big ag, big anything is just the natural outgrowth of big government. Having those big regulatory agencies creates. In fact, there was recently, they ended Chevron deference, and a lot of progressives got upset that Chevron deference was ending. And what they don't recognize is that Chevron deference actually started from the Supreme Court saying, we're going to let the regulatory agencies decide not to hold Chevron accountable to the regulations. That's why it's called Chevron deference. And so when the regulatory agencies said, yeah, we said that oil companies would have to engage in these certain regulations that we've set, but we've decided not to hold them to it. The Supreme Court said, well, even though the law says that they're supposed to, we'll leave it to the regulators to decide whether or not to do it. And so it truly was a deference to Chevron via the regulatory agency that it had captured. And so my contention here, or what I'm asserting here, is that you won't see the big ag and the big pharma and the big everything else like it is right now when there's less regulatory environment, because those barriers to entries are cut down, because we no longer have these mandates that we have to use their products and services, sometimes exclusively. There no longer be these massive carve-outs where we're essentially paying taxes to subsidize and give them breaks while we pay the taxes for it. If you don't have that anymore, then you have a much larger and more competitive environment, and these companies wouldn't get that big to begin with. You reach a certain point where if absent those regulations, a company reaches a certain point where it becomes too unwieldy to compete with its smaller and more agile competitors, unless the government protects it from those competitors. So that's precisely what I'm saying. Whether you agree or disagree with my assertion, what my assertion is that those things don't exist, at least not in the way that we see them now, absent those regulatory buildups that we've seen over time.
Yeah, it's interesting. The more I listen to you, the more Zephyr Teachout and what we might think of as progressives come to mind. She was on the show a couple of years ago. I'm sure you're familiar with her book, Break 'em Up, Recovering Our Freedom from Big Ag, Big Tech, and Big Money. In a curious way, you seem quite allied to progressives on the left like Teachout, aren't you?
We're certainly allied in the desired outcome. In the same way that we're allied with progressives who are disgusted by our healthcare system and how ridiculously expensive and overly burdensome it is. Where we're not allied is in our policy prescription for how to do that, which are often 180 different, or certainly much different from one another. Whereas a lot of progressives think that more government involvement, government did this much damage when it was this big, and it did this much more damage when it was this big. If it were just this big, that it could finally fix it. We say no. The problem is that government has tried to centrally plan this, and lo and behold, the politicians and regulators and bureaucrats made friends with the wealthiest people, not the rest of us, and they're protecting them and not us, and making us pay for it. It's a shocker that happened. Again, I'm being facetious, but the reality is, we believe that by eliminating, or at least greatly reducing, those regulatory burdens, you end up with a more competitive market. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying there aren't still going to be billionaires or large companies or anything else. What I'm saying is the only way they'll be able to have that status is by being so hyper tuned into the needs of their consumer that no one wants to do business with the others, or not as much as they do with them. And that isn't bad. It's not a bad thing if someone becomes a billionaire or if a company becomes a multi-billion or trillion-dollar business, as long as they're doing it by hyper fixating on the needs of the consumer, not on how tied in they can get with the regulatory agencies and the politicians that control them. So no, so yeah, we absolutely have the same, I would say the same desired outcome, which is a more competitive and for lack of a better word, level playing field. It's just the policy prescription is in some cases opposite or certainly much different.
As you can tell, I'm not a libertarian myself. I'm skeptical of it.
No. Really?
But one of the things that this came up in my conversation with Valerie Durham, one of the things I like about, quote unquote, the libertarian movement is it's a relatively large tent. I could imagine Zephyr Teachout, for example, being invited to Freedom Fest and probably even showing up. She noted that this year, Cornel West, another old friend of mine, is at the event. Not everyone's thrilled. And I'm sure his session will be very lively. What is it, Spike, about the libertarians that create perhaps a more open tent, more tolerance, perhaps even humor? I know in your conversation with Daryl Davis, you're also talking about the ability to listen, maybe the sort of the braver angel side of the libertarian movement.
Yeah, so I would say at its core, libertarians, and I'm speaking very broadly, but I would say generally speaking, your average libertarian would like to be left alone to the extent that they want to be able to make decisions for themselves, provided again that they're not infringing on anyone else's lives, rights, or properties. And they afford that same thing to you. They may hate your lifestyle. They may hate and disagree with your opinions on things. They may never even want to be in the same room as you, but they don't want to enforce their opinion on you, and they don't want you to enforce your opinion on them. And so I would say a natural outgrowth of that is that when we have an event like Freedom Fest, we're very tolerant of the kinds of opinions that we have within reason, but we certainly are tolerant of having people with different opinions there. And so when Cornel West, who in many ways has talked about his love for freedom in many ways, says he'd like to come, fantastic, you can come. And if we disagree with you on 99% of what you say, even better. That means we can have a dialogue about it. Daryl Davis, who you've shown the screenshot there from his wiki, who I spoke with. Daryl Davis is a black man who went and reached out and met with Klan members, became their friends, and ultimately got somewhere around 200 of them to quit the Klan. He didn't originally seek out to have them quit the Klan. He sought to have them answer a very simple, or what seems to be a simple question. Why do you hate me when you don't even know me? Now, the fact that a black man who not only knows the history of the Klan, but also had some violent run-ins with Klan members himself when he was trying to meet with some of these folks, continued to see them as individual human beings, not as a Klan member or a racist, but a person who is standing in front of him who, for whatever reason, felt like he should be putting on a robe and hating an entire race or multiple races of people. And he thought, I need to find out what that guy's about and why it is he wants to do that. And I bet we can have a good discussion about that. The level of, you said braver angels, the level of respect for the individual humanity of another person that requires, I don't know that I'll ever reach quite that point that Daryl Davis has, but I think that's at the core of what we believe. Your first question you asked me, what is libertarianism? I call it the principle of human respect. When we respect each other as individual human beings, we are our most happy. We are our most prosperous, our most harmonious, our most free for that matter. And to whatever extent we aren't respected as individual human beings, to whatever extent we are taken from, we are robbed, we are in debts are put up in our name, we are ordered around and told what to do even though we aren't harming anyone. We are treated as something other than a person. We're dehumanized, and sometimes unspeakable things happen to us as a result. We are obviously less happy, less free, less harmonious, less everything. And so that is at the core of what we believe, and a natural outgrowth of that is empathy for others. So if I forget the name of the person you were talking about with the book about breaking up the big ag and big tech.
No, sorry, not Terry, Zephyr Teachout.
if Zephyr Teachout asked to come to Freedom Fest, or we might even, Freedom Fest might even invite, I'm not sure if that's a man or a woman, but would invite Zephyr to.
Woman.
Okay, if Freedom Fest were to invite her and she were to come, we'd be very happy to hear what she had to say. And if it turned out we disagreed with 99% of what she had to say, fantastic opportunity for a dialogue. So I would say a natural outgrowth of just our desire to allow others to be able to live their lives, provided they aren't harming anyone else directly. Is a natural outgrowth of that is a lot of tolerance for opinions that we might actually disagree with quite a bit.
Are there limits, though, Spike, to that tolerance? When you ran for vice president in 2020, there was some controversy about your position on gun policy and gun rights. Could you, for example, have a conversation with a parent at Columbine or someone else whose child has been murdered by some maniac in a school killing on gun rights? So at what point does that toleration end? Do you have to exercise some degree of concern on some of these conversations, particularly something like gun rights, which in some ways is interestingly abstract intellectually, and in other ways has such a catastrophic impact and has had such a catastrophic impact on people's lives?
Absolutely. I had a discussion last April with David Hogg, who, besides being the head of March for Our Lives and now the vice chair of a vice chair of the Democratic Party, he's also one of the survivors of the shooting in, I forget which one it was called at this point, but one of the ones that happened in Florida. And we had quite a lively discussion. We came away still disagreeing about things, but we did agree that we all want to live in a safer environment. One of the things that I pointed to is that there is zero correlation, either in the United States or internationally, between the amount of guns that are owned per capita and the level of murders that happen in that country. If you were to take the different countries and put them on a map, and have one axis be the guns per capita, guns per capita, and the other one being the homicide rate, it would look like you had taken a bunch of confetti and thrown it on a map. There's zero correlation. It almost looks random by design. It's that low of a correlation. Now, obviously, when you're having a discussion with someone who's been so heavily impacted by something like a shooting, I don't go in there with charts and graphs. I would be more than happy to hear what they have to say. And I would be incredibly empathetic to the devastation that caused. At You Are the Power, we work with a lot of people who are at the most desperate point in their lives, usually at the hands of something that's being done by an out of control government official or agency. But the effect is the same. When someone is going through something terribly, you have to meet them where they are. I'm not going to go to someone who has had some horrific thing happen, like losing someone to a shooting, or themselves surviving a shooting or being shot or something like that, and immediately start, pounding them with statistics and facts. Even if I'm factually correct, fantastic. I just showed that person I couldn't care less about them. No one cares about what you know until they know that you care about them. And that's at the core of not just what we do at You Are the Power, but also of my ethos of how you deal with people. You deal with people by meeting them where they are. And I may be able to have an incredibly fruitful conversation with someone who lost a loved one in a shooting, and they may come away having a different opinion. They may come away having the exact same opinion. They may not even want to have a discussion with me when they know that I believe that I believe fully in the right to keep and bear arms. At any rate, I can only control what I'm doing in that equation, and that is to try to meet people where they are, to empathize with them on their position, and to have a dialogue and a discussion with them about that.
Some of your arguments will no doubt resonate with some people. I mean, some of the stuff you're saying sounds progressive, other times more conservative. But the reality is, Spike, don't need me to tell you this, when you ran for vice president in 2020, the party got just over 1% of the vote, which was, I think, half of what the Libertarians got in 2016. So it seems to me as if most Americans it just doesn't resonate, at least on a political level. I know you're not involved so much with the politics of the Libertarian Party now, and I'm going to come to You Are the Power, your new organization, in a few minutes. But is that what you learned in 2020, that for all these arguments and the backwards and forwards, it's just impossible, for better or worse, to break through in America today?
So that's
to indeed escape the the monopoly of the two parties?
Yeah, so there's actually two different questions there. One is, do people agree with the at least some of the tenets of libertarianism? And the other one is, can a third party, including the Libertarian Party, break free from the duopoly or the uniparty system we have now? I do not equate the after one of the things I learned traveling around the country is I talked to a lot of people, and just about everyone I talked to would say something along the line, including many people who interviewed me and many people that called into radio shows I was doing and people that emailed us and so forth. I heard over and over again, largely the same thing. I agree with everything you're saying. I can't vote for you. You're not going to win. So I would not equate to the vote count that any third party gets to whether or not people agree with its the ideology behind that party or that campaign. What I believe, I think what is much more representative of how people believe in or adapt to libertarianism as an ideology, not as a political party or as a campaign or anything like that, but as an ideology, is the work we're doing at You Are the Power. When we present these examples, these causes, what we do at You Are the Power, we find people that are being harmed by out of control government officials. We alert the public to their case. We present everything so that it doesn't look like it's some skewed thing we're presenting them. We present them with all the evidence that we have, that we've heavily vetted on these causes. And then we invite them not to just rail against the overly authoritarian Leviathan government. We tell them about these specific human beings who are in government, who are doing this specific action to the people that we're telling them about, to this family or this individual that we're telling them about.
Give them their email addresses and their phone numbers to be
giving them their email addresses and phone numbers so that they can contact them and ask them not to do that anymore. We even give them the wording that they can use in case they don't necessarily have the most constructive words to use for those people when they find out about this stuff. And we have had a 100% success rate. People who were wrongfully arrested after speaking at their city council meetings about corruption in their local government have had their charges dropped, and many of the officials who did that against them have resigned or sought not to seek re-election. We found corrupt local sheriffs and government officials who were doing really terrible things. We alerted the public about it, and those public officials ended up resigning. We have, as I said before, we've reunited families who their children were wrongfully taken from them, and the parents were facing decades in jail.
Let's end here. You know, you've said that a couple of times, and as I said, I want you to talk about You Are the Power. You keep on mentioning these examples, and I can't call you on it because I don't know enough about it myself. But I have to admit, I'm slightly skeptical. What are you saying, that the government is taking children from parents? Why?
Yes.
You on your You Are the Power front page, you have a picture of a couple of young American parents with a young child. What exactly are you saying the government is doing?
The federal government, under Title 4D of the Social Security Act, pays state child protective services every time that they accuse a parent of abuse. It doesn't matter if they actually end up actually being abused. When they open a case and call it abuse, that begins the funding. And if the children are taken from those parents and put in foster care, they get even more money. And if those children end up being permanently separated from their parents and placed in permanent in an adoptive home, they get even more money. And then if it turns out that child is chronically ill, they get even more money. And so that has created an environment in most of the states in this country whereby when the so-called child abuse pediatricians, which there is no such thing as child abuse pediatrics, it's just a pediatrician who is empowered by the government to accuse people of abuse or say whether or not a child is being abused, when they see a child who is chronically ill, who has fractures and bruises, they know that if they accuse the parents of abuse, that child is the maximum funding child because they already know it's sick. And so we have multiple, and if you're skeptical, I'm happy to pass you along to my volunteer director, and we can give you the mountains of evidence that we have on every single one of these families where the government as a system, not just the individuals that are doing this, but as a system, they denied them the ability not just to get a second opinion, but even to access their children's medical records, their medical testimony from medical experts who diagnosed these children with chronic health conditions was not allowed in the family courts. We recently had a case with the Hernandez family where it wasn't even allowed in the criminal court, and the jury was not allowed to hear any exonerating evidence from the defense's side. Thankfully, the jury saw through it and voted not guilty on all counts because the fix was so obviously in. But no, that is exactly what I am saying. And I understand your skepticism. It's the same skepticism I had back in 2023 when we first heard about the Hernandez family. And after spending dozens of hours of having our team vet this cause, we found out it was actually worse than they said that it was. And then when we came forward with the Hernandez family story and brought it out there, two things happened. Number one, the judge started backing off and allowing them to see their children again, and started kind of allowing for a little bit for more parental rights there. The other thing that happened was families came from out of the woodwork in Georgia and across the country. And we discovered that this was not just a rogue agency or a rogue agent. This was a systemic, perverse funding mechanism that starts at the federal government, works its way through the states, and ends up harming countless parents across the country every single year in children's hospitals and in child protective services across the country. And now, a good thing from that, not only have we reunited multiple families, but we've also gotten Ridge's Law. That video that you see, the screenshot there is of Governor Brian Kemp shaking the hands of the Collins family and their son, Ridge Collins. Ridge's Law is named after Ridge. And what it does is it requires that parents are allowed to get a second opinion from a state-recognized doctor of their choice, at their expense, but of their choice, and that the medical professional who has accused them of abuse has to actually attest from now on, that they actually reviewed the child's medical history before accusing them of abuse. And if you think it's insane that they didn't have to do that beforehand, that's how it is in most states. And we've already had lawmakers reach out to us from other states to see if they have this problem in their state, and if so, how they can fix it. Now, the reason I bring this up is because that came from millions of people interacting with our pieces about these families by sharing the content, by reaching out to these public officials, by asking them to do the right thing here, to introduce these laws, to back off and allow these parents to see their children if it's at the point to do so, to even drop the charges against them, to drop the case against them. I believe that more demonstrates whether people more congeal or have more agreement with our ideas than like the result that a third party gets in a system that's rigged for the first two parties. Now, does that mean libertarianism is universally recognized? No, but I think most people want to be respected as individual human beings, and they want to respect others as individual human beings, provided that they're not harming anyone in the actions that they take.
Final question. You've chosen to, it seems, to run with this on You Are the Power, this example of government taking advantage of parents for their own, seems you're arguing, economic self-interest. Aren't there other things, though, that are more outrageous from a libertarian point of view? Why have you chosen this one as opposed to, say, criminal justice reform?
Well, this is a form of criminal justice reform. Like I said, in the case of the Hernandez
one, where you're clearly attracting young parents and maybe suburban parents, whereas when it comes to criminal justice, we've done lots of shows on the way in which the government seems to be abusing young men, particularly young black and brown men, of their freedom. Why choose this issue over criminal justice?
Well, the short answer is they brought it to us. So You Were the Power originally started to just do local things. This is the first statewide thing we've ever taken on, and now it's becoming a nationwide thing. Initially, we only took on local causes across the country, but at the local level. We've dealt with cases where people were wrongfully assaulted and wrongfully arrested by police officers, and they refused to release their body cam footage. We've dealt with all sorts of different causes. Ultimately, we started in 2022, and we've been taking on causes that are brought to us. Many of the families that have been affected by this are black families and brown families. The Hernandez family is a Hispanic man and a Thai woman.
You have Michael and Tasha Patterson, again, another one on your page. So
yeah, and we don't make choices based on race and for or against any race. We ultimately at this point we're all hands on deck, taking them in as we can, vetting them as we can, and bringing them to the public as we can. But we don't make decisions based on race. But we certainly make decisions based on what is something that we can actually affect. Because I can say, hey, criminal justice is a major problem. We need to end the war on drugs, end qualified immunity, and so forth. We don't have the wherewithal to do that right now, but we do have the wherewithal to stop this family from being completely destroyed. But we can, and from starting at these things that we can do and building up from there, there's no upper limit to what we can do. But I absolutely believe that things like the war on drugs and qualified immunity and a host of other things that I know we don't have the time to get into should be ended, or at least
very briefly, Spike, immigration.
Well, let's go back to what the founders said. They left that to the states. There's nothing in the federal constitution that says anything about the government controlling who can come into or out of the country, except in the case of a military invasion, which this is not. And so in that case, it is, according to the 10th Amendment, to be left to the states and to the people. That is the policy that we had for the first 100 years of this country's existence. And we didn't have any real problems. The problems came with U.S. government involvement in other countries, which destabilized them and brings those people here to get away from the destabilization, the welfare state, many other things that have acted as magnets for people who aren't necessarily coming here to work, but to get benefits from the country, and a host of other things. That the problem isn't immigration. The problem is what government has done outside of immigration, which has created that situation. So no, I think we should, again, if you return back to a model more resembling what the Constitution outlines, you end up with a situation in which people are largely free to come here. When they come here, they're on their own to make it work or not. And I think that solves a lot of the problems and anxieties that people have when it comes to immigration. Keep in mind, we have had situations in multiple administrations where people have actually been brought in by plane, and that's not immigration. That's a type of importation where the government's actually bringing people in, and that's a completely different thing. So now you're having this like overcorrection where now they're arresting green card holders at the border and things like that. So no, I think that this whole thing is an entire mess. Do we are the power? You are the power have the wherewithal to do anything about that right now? Not really, but we can do the things that we're doing right now and build up to be able to do those types of things in the future.
Maybe we do indeed need to go back to Benjamin Franklin, according to Mark Skousen, the founder of Freedom Fest, the greatest American. Interesting conversation. You haven't completely convinced me, Spike. But,
well, I only had an hour, so
you had an hour. So if we do this for a few more hours, maybe you will. But you're articulate and principled, and it's an interesting conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate being on.